The hall was filled with over 400 people. Suits, laughter, clinking glasses, and the kind of energy that only comes when powerful people gather in one room. I stood near the back, hands pressed flat against my thighs to keep them still. My name was Kade Harlow. I was 28 years old. I had built Harlow Innovations from nothing. One rented desk, one freezing laptop, 3 years of missed sleep and skipped meals. The Westfield Industry Awards were the biggest night in our sector, and when the host finally called my company's name, my chest lifted. My heart beat faster. I leaned forward. But the man who walked up to that stage was not me. It was my father, Richard Vale. He climbed the steps smoothly, smiling wide, waving at the crowd like someone who had been waiting for this exact moment his entire life. He took the award from the host's hands, held it above his head, and the room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. The audience rose. I watched from the back of that glowing hall as the man who had nothing to do with building my company accepted recognition for every hour I had ever poured into it. My hands went still. Something cold and quiet settled into my chest. I found my father in a corridor just off the main hall after the ceremony. He was still holding the award, turning it slowly in his hands. I walked up to him and kept my voice low. I asked why he had not mentioned me once during his speech. He looked up with the patient smile of someone who believes the person in front of them simply does not understand how the world works. He said, "Don't ruin the moment, son. This is how the world sees it." I asked what that meant. He set the award down on a nearby table and straightened his jacket. He explained that his name was on the company registration. His name was on the original lease. His signature was the one investors saw first when they came in. He said none of that was an accident. I reminded him that I had come to him for help with the paperwork years ago, when I was 25 and did not fully understand legal filings. That was all I had asked for. I had never handed him ownership of anything. He looked at me quietly. Then he picked up the award again and said the night was still young. He walked back toward the crowd without another word. I stood alone in that corridor. Not panicking. Just understanding, clearly and fully, that something was very wrong. I stayed in the office until past midnight. The building was empty except for the hum of the air conditioning and the glow of my screen. I pulled up every file I could find. Emails. Reports. Internal memos. Project logs going back over 2 years. I told myself I was overreacting, that there had to be an explanation, that Richard had simply forgotten to mention me in the moment. But the more I read, the colder the room felt. I found memos sent to department heads listing Richard Vale as the lead architect on projects I had personally designed. One document described him as the visionary behind our flagship product, a supply chain software tool I had built almost entirely on my own over 5 hard months. I remembered those 5 months clearly. The weekends I did not take. The evenings my friends stopped calling because I was never available. That software was mine in every way that mattered. And yet here it was, officially attributed to someone else, on company letterhead, on a distribution list that included our 3 biggest investors. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. This had not happened overnight. Someone had been quietly and carefully rewriting the story of how Harlow Innovations was built. And that someone was my father. Her name was Priya Osei, and she had been with the company since the very beginning. She was our head of operations, sharp and steady, the kind of person who noticed everything but said very little unless she was certain. The morning after the awards, she appeared at my office door before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. She stepped inside quietly, closed the door behind her, and set a folder on my desk without a word. I opened it slowly. Inside were printed emails, time-stamped reports, and signed project approvals, all bearing my name as the originating source. My original pitch deck. My handwritten design notes, scanned and preserved. A full email chain from 18 months ago where I had laid out the entire product roadmap in detail, and Richard had replied with a single line, "Good work. Keep pushing." Priya sat down across from me and folded her hands on her lap. She said she had been collecting these quietly for several months. She had not known exactly what was coming, but something had felt wrong, and she had wanted to be prepared. I asked why she had not said anything sooner. She looked at me steadily and said she had been waiting to see what I would do first. I understood exactly what she meant. The interviews began appearing online that same week. Richard was suddenly everywhere. A business podcast. A trade publication profile. A video feature on an industry news site. In every one, the story was identical. He described himself as the founder of Harlow Innovations. He spoke about identifying a gap in the market, assembling the right team, and turning his vision into a growing company. When interviewers mentioned the technical work, he waved his hand and said something like, "I had a junior manager helping me execute things on the ground." He never said my name. Not in any interview. Within days, I started receiving different treatment from people in the building. An investor's assistant emailed to reschedule a meeting and mentioned he would be looping in Richard's office going forward. A journalist who had previously reached out to me directly sent the same request to Richard's email instead. I was being quietly removed from my own story. Investors who had originally asked to speak with me about product direction were now going through Richard's calendar. The company I had built was still running, still growing, but my name had been stripped from its history as cleanly as a label peeled off a jar. The jar remained. The name was simply gone. I made a decision that week. I was not going to argue loudly. I was not going to send an angry email or call a meeting demanding an explanation. I had already seen what direct confrontation looked like. Richard had smiled and walked away. If I was going to correct this, it needed to be something he could not walk away from. Something he could not dismiss with a calm voice and a redirect. It had to happen in front of people whose opinions shaped the future of the company, and it had to be built on evidence, not emotion. So I let him continue. I watched him give more interviews. I watched him accept congratulations from people who did not know better. I watched him build his version of events higher and higher. And while he enjoyed the spotlight, I sat quietly and began building something else. I pulled out a fresh notebook and started writing everything down in careful order. Every project, every date, every decision I had made and when. Every dollar amount, every problem I had solved, every name connected to my work. Priya helped me fill in gaps. We spoke in low voices. We moved carefully. Richard had no idea what was beginning to take shape just beneath the surface of the company he thought he now fully controlled. About 2 weeks into my quiet preparation, I found something that changed the weight of everything. I had been going through old investor communications, specifically the ones sent before our first major funding round. Most of it was standard back and forth. But buried in one long email thread, I found a message Richard had sent to our lead investor, a man named Alistair Ford. In that email, Richard had described Harlow Innovations as a company whose intellectual foundation was built entirely by his son Kade. He had written those words himself, in plain language, to secure the investment. He had used my reputation and my name to open the door. Then, once the money came in, he had stepped in front of it. But that was not all. Further down in the same thread, Richard had asked me, in writing, to handle the innovation quietly, without drawing attention to the technical side. He had framed it as competitive strategy. But reading it now, I understood what it actually was. It was an instruction to stay invisible. To build without being seen building. He had planned this, or something very close to it, much earlier than I had realized. And now, in a time-stamped email chain he had written himself, was his own admission that the innovation was mine. 3 weeks later, Richard called a board meeting. The agenda was framed around company vision and future strategy, which was the kind of neutral language that carried serious weight in a room of people who controlled money. I arrived early, sat in my usual place, and said nothing unusual. I watched Richard enter and open the meeting with a polished presentation that positioned him as the company's founding visionary. He spoke about early insight, market leadership, and the decisions that had shaped the company's growth. He was smooth. He was convincing. Midway through, board member Constance Webb asked a precise technical question about how our core product had been designed. Richard smiled and said it was all part of his original framework. He gestured at the slides and added, almost laughing, that it was all his work, really. He said he had just had good people helping him execute. He was sitting 6 feet from me when he said it. He did not look at me once. I had brought the folder Priya had assembled. I had also brought 3 additional documents I had compiled myself over the previous weeks. I said nothing. I kept the folder in my lap and held my expression steady. The right moment was not in that boardroom. But it was close. Over the following days I finished assembling everything. The complete document trail was organized carefully across a thick binder that Priya and I had built together. It contained the original patent filings for our 3 core products, all listing me as inventor of record. It contained the internal project logs showing my name as led across every major development phase. It contained signed approval documents from vendors and development partners, all directed to me personally. It contained the email from Alistair Ford's thread in which Richard had identified me as the company's intellectual foundation. And it contained the separate message in which Richard had asked me to handle the innovation quietly. Together, these documents told one clear, verifiable story. There was no version of events in which Richard could look at all of this and maintain his claim. Every document had a date. Every timestamp was checkable. Priya and I had cross-referenced everything twice. There were no gaps. No weak links. Nothing that could be dismissed as a single misremembered detail. I held the completed binder one evening and felt something settle inside me that had been unsettled for weeks. The evidence was ready. The truth was contained, organized, and waiting. All I needed now was the right place to let it speak. The Northgate Industry Gala was announced about 10 days later. It was the most prominent event in our sector, held annually, attended by every major investor, partner, and journalist that covered our space. Richard had been invited to deliver the keynote address. I saw the confirmation forwarded to me by Priya, who had been copied on the company email chain. The speech topic had been announced as, Building a Company from the Ground Up, Vision, Leadership, and Legacy. I read that subject line 3 times. Then I forwarded it quietly to my own personal inbox and closed my laptop. I had known I needed a stage with the right audience. I had known I needed a moment where the gap between what was being claimed and what was actually true could not be ignored. The Northgate Gala was all of that in a single night. Richard would stand in front of hundreds of people who shaped the company's future and tell the story of a business I had built. He would do it with his polished delivery and easy confidence. And I was going to let him begin. I was going to let him find his rhythm and settle into his story. Then I was going to make sure the truth arrived right behind him, on a screen large enough for the entire room to read. I reached out to Harmon Tate the following week. He was a retired industry consultant with 30 years of experience advising product development teams. I had worked with him briefly 2 years earlier when I was developing the architecture for our second core product. He had spent 3 days reviewing my work and signed off on a formal technical assessment. He remembered me clearly. We met for coffee and I laid out what had been happening. He listened without interrupting, his expression calm and level. When I finished, he said he was not surprised. He had seen similar situations before, though usually between business partners rather than between a father and a son. He agreed to attend the gala and speak on the record if needed. Then he leaned forward and said something I needed to hear. He warned me that Richard had been around long enough to have built protections I might not fully see. His name on certain documents gave him a position that could not be undone in a hurry. Timing would matter more than anything else, Harmon said. If I moved too early or too loudly, Richard would reframe it as a family dispute, which would be harder to counter than a factual one. I nodded. I understood. The evidence had to arrive all at once, in front of people who could not look away. The night of the gala arrived on a cool Thursday evening. I dressed simply. A clean dark suit, a plain tie. I was not going to perform. I was going to correct a record. I arrived 30 minutes before the doors opened and found the event coordinator, a calm and efficient woman named Bea Solis. I had contacted Bea the previous week through a mutual professional connection and explained what I needed. I had sent her the presentation file in advance. She had asked a few careful questions, listened to my answers, and agreed to help. She was not taking sides. She understood that what I was requesting was a factual correction backed by sourced documents, and that accurate information was in everyone's interest. BEA confirmed that the presentation was loaded and ready. She walked me through the technical setup. There was a large screen behind the main stage and 2 side displays. Every person in that room would be able to see clearly. I thanked her and slipped into the crowd before doors opened fully. I found a position at the side of the room, partially behind a pillar, where I could see both the stage and the screens at once. I watched guests arrive. I watched cameras position themselves. I watched the room fill with exactly the people this moment needed. Then I saw Richard walk in, already shaking hands. The keynote began just after 9. Richard took the stage to warm applause. He stood at the podium, adjusted the microphone, and smiled at the room with the ease of someone completely at home in a spotlight. He thanked the organizers, then leaned in and said he wanted to tell the audience a story about where Harlow Innovations really came from. His voice was warm. His pacing was perfect. He described waking up with an idea. He described the early days of building, the risks he had taken, the decisions he had made. He spoke about the supply chain software, our flagship product, describing it as something he had conceived during a period of personal reflection on what the market was missing. He said he had always believed that the right idea, held by the right person, would find its way into the world. I stood at the side of the room with my phone in my hand. BEA Solis was near the control panel, watching me. Richard moved smoothly through his second page. The room was fully settled into his story. I waited. I let him build. I let his confidence grow to its highest point. Then, just as he paused for breath before moving into his legacy section, I looked across the room at BEA. I gave her the signal. She nodded once and pressed the key. The screens behind Richard came to life. Not with his slides. With mine. The first image was the original patent filing for our flagship product, dated 3 years ago, with my name printed clearly as inventor of record. The second was a page from the internal project log, showing my name as project lead across every development phase. The third was the email from Alistair Ford's thread, the one where Richard himself had written that the company's intellectual foundation was built entirely by me. The room reacted first with stillness. Then came the murmurs. Heads turned. Investors leaned toward each other. Several people near the front stood slightly to read the screens more closely. Richard had stopped speaking. He turned and looked at the projection behind him, his face completely blank. Then he turned back to the audience. He tried to smile. He opened his mouth. But the room had already shifted. People were reading the documents, not watching him. A journalist near the left wall had her phone raised, photographing the screens. Another was already typing. The murmurs grew louder. Someone near the back spoke to the person beside them, and that person nodded firmly. Richard gripped the sides of the podium. He tried to find solid ground. But the foundation of his story had already begun to crack beneath him. I moved along the side wall and stepped calmly onto the edge of the stage. A microphone stand was positioned there, part of the event's standard format for panel remarks, which BEA had arranged in advance. Richard saw me approach. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I stepped up to the microphone and spoke clearly, without rushing. I told the room my name was Kade Harlow. I said I was the founder of Harlow Innovations in the original and complete meaning of that word. I said every patent on the screens behind me listed me as inventor of record. I said every project log identified me as project lead. I said the email now visible on the screen had been written by Richard Vale himself, to our lead investor, in which he described me as the company's intellectual foundation. I paused and let the room sit with that. Then I said I was not there to make an accusation. I was there to set the record straight, because the record belonged to everyone present, including the investors, the partners, and the journalists who had been reporting the company's story. My voice stayed level throughout. I did not raise it. I had rehearsed none of it out loud, but I had lived every sentence of it for 3 years. Richard had not moved from the podium. His face was no longer blank. It was pale. The reaction from the investor section was immediate. Several people pulled out phones and tablets and began cross-referencing what was on the screens with their own records. I watched one man in a grey suit lean toward the woman beside him and point at his screen, then at the projection. She nodded slowly. Another investor, a younger man from a venture group that had joined our second funding round, walked closer to the side screen and studied the patent document carefully before photographing it. Constance Webb sat very still, arms folded, eyes moving steadily between me and the displays. Nobody was watching Richard in the way they had been 5 minutes earlier. He was still at the podium, but the room's attention had lifted away from him. 2 investors I did not recognize by name had stepped into a corner together and were speaking quietly. A third had separated from the group entirely and was on a phone call. I could not hear any of their conversations. I did not need to. The quiet reshuffling of their attention was enough. These were people who made decisions based on accurate information. And the information they had been working with for months had just been revealed to be incomplete. They were not deciding whether to believe Richard anymore. They were deciding what to do next. The journalists moved quickly. Within minutes of the screens going live, 2 reporters near the front had already published short posts with photographs attached. One headline read, "Disputed credit at Northgate Gala, documents surface naming Kade Harlow as true founder." Another simply posted the photograph of the patent filing with a caption identifying the inventor of record. The room had become its own news cycle in real time. A camera operator originally positioned to film Richard's speech had quietly rotated toward the screens. A second camera was now trained on me. I spoke slowly, aware I was on record, aware every word would be played back. I explained each document as it appeared on the screen. I named dates. I read the relevant lines aloud without editorializing. I let the language of the documents carry the argument, because it was stronger than anything I could have constructed myself. Harmon Tate was standing near the entrance to the hall, arms folded, watching steadily. He caught my eye once and gave a short, firm nod. The room felt charged, but I kept my breathing even and my pace deliberate. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment. I was not going to rush through the last part of it now that it had finally arrived. Richard came off stage during a brief pause. A gala staff member had approached the podium and indicated that proceedings would continue shortly, giving Richard a window to step back without it appearing to be a retreat. He found me backstage in the narrow corridor between the curtain and the service door. His voice was low and sharp. He said I had made a serious mistake. He said I had no idea what I had just done and that there would be consequences. I waited until he finished. Then I said, in the same tone I had used at the microphone, that the patent filings were public record. The email chain was verifiable. Harmon Tate was in the room, prepared to speak to the technical assessment he had conducted on my work. I said I had not insulted him. I had not called him anything in public. I had simply presented documents. Richard opened his mouth. Then he closed it. A cameraman had appeared at the far end of the corridor, lens raised. He had not followed us, but anything said loudly would be captured. Richard looked at the camera. Then back at me. The sharpness in his face shifted into something more careful. He said this was not over. I told him quietly, without any heat at all, that I agreed with him completely. Then I turned and walked back into the hall. Harmon Tate addressed a group of journalists and investors who had gathered near the side of the room, about 15 people, small but significant. He had not been formally introduced. He simply stepped into the space that had opened naturally, the way someone does when they have something real to say and know the room will hear them. He introduced himself by name and by 30 years in the industry. He explained that he had conducted a formal technical assessment of Harlow Innovations' core product architecture 2 years ago at my direct request. He said the work he reviewed had been entirely mine. He said the level of technical detail, the coherence of the design, and the quality of the documentation were consistent with deep individual authorship, not with delegated execution. He said he had signed a written report confirming this, which was dated and on file. He said he had seen nothing in his time working with the company that suggested Richard Vale had any direct role in the technical development of the products bearing the Harlow Innovations name. He stopped there. He did not editorialize. He said what was true and stood by it. The journalists were writing steadily. Richard had come back into the hall by then and was standing near the far wall. When Harmon finished speaking, Richard looked down at the floor. He did not say a word. Constance Webb found me near the back of the hall about 20 minutes later. She came without a crowd around her, quietly, the way she approached everything important. She said she had reviewed the documents on the screens carefully. She had also called another board member during the break, who had pulled up the patent records independently and confirmed what she was seeing. Then she said something I had not expected. She said the board had been given an incomplete picture of the company's origins and that this was a governance matter, not simply a personal one. The board carried a responsibility to act on accurate information, and tonight had provided significantly more accurate information than they had previously held. She paused and looked at me directly. She said she was prepared to move for a formal recognition of founding authorship at the next board session. She asked whether I was willing to submit the full document trail for official board review. I said yes without hesitation. She gave one firm nod. No handshake, no smile, no reassurance, just a nod. Then she walked back toward the investors section with the calm certainty of someone who had already made her decision and was simply following through on it. I watched her go and let myself breathe for the first time all evening. Richard made one more attempt to recover before the night ended. He found a small cluster of investors who had not yet fully committed to a position and worked his way toward them. I could see him from across the room. He was smiling again, quieter this time, speaking in a lower register, leaning slightly toward whoever he was addressing. I recognized the approach. He was trying to reframe the evening as a misunderstanding, a family tension blown out of proportion by the emotions of someone who had confused his supporting role with ownership. But it was not working the way it once would have. The investors he spoke to were nodding politely, but their eyes kept moving to the documents still visible on the side screen. One excused himself within 2 minutes and walked away without committing to anything. Another pulled out his phone while Richard was still mid-sentence and began reading something quietly. Richard adjusted. He tried a different angle. A different tone. A different framing. Each time he sensed resistance, he pivoted. But every version of his story was now being held up against what the documents showed, and the comparison was not in his favor. Every word he added gave the truth more room to breathe. He kept talking. The room kept drifting away from him. Later that night I stood alone near the far window as the gala wound down. People were gathering their things, exchanging quiet words, moving toward the exits. I had the full document trail in my bag. Constance Webb had confirmed board action. Harmon Tate had spoken on the record. The journalists had already published. The evidence was out in the world now, and nothing would bring it back. I thought, for a moment, about how much further I could take this. The email in which Richard had instructed me to handle the innovation quietly was evidence enough, if I chose to escalate legally, to raise serious questions about misrepresentation to investors. The board could move to strip his title. His carefully built public image could be dismantled entirely if I kept applying pressure. I had the tools. I had the support. I could make this far worse for him. I held that thought. Then I let it go. I had not built all of this to destroy him. I had built it to restore what was true. There was a difference between those two things, and I needed to keep that line clear in my own mind, more for my own sake than anyone else's. The record had been set straight. The truth was now on file and in print. That was what I had come for. The formal acknowledgement came 4 days later. Constance Webb called a special board session. I submitted the complete document trail in advance, and every board member had reviewed it before the meeting began. The session lasted just over an hour. Richard attended. He sat at the far end of the table and said very little. When Constance presented the motion to formally recognize Kade Harlow as the originating founder and primary intellectual author of Harlow Innovation's core products, it passed without opposition. Not because Richard suddenly agreed with it, but because there was nothing left to oppose it with. The evidence had done its work. The board issued a formal statement the same afternoon, distributed to all investors, partners, and press contacts. It named me clearly. It corrected the public record that had been constructed over the preceding months. It referenced the patent filings, the project documentation, and the technical assessment conducted by Harmon Tate. Richard was present when the board secretary read the statement aloud. I watched his face as each sentence landed. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had reached the end of a road he had believed was longer. Afterward, as people filed out, he paused beside me for a moment. He did not speak. He just stood there briefly, then walked out. That silence said more than anything he had managed all evening. The days that followed were different in every way that counted. The corrected story moved fast. 2 journalists who had been at the gala published full accounts, including images of the documents, excerpts from Richard's original speech, and Harmon Tate's on-record statement. Trade publications followed within 48 hours. Our investors received direct communication from the board, and several of them responded with visible relief rather than alarm, which told me they had already been uncertain about what they had been told. My inbox filled with messages from people I had not heard from in months. Partners who had quietly redirected correspondence to Richard began writing to me directly again. A developer who had worked with me on the original build sent a short note saying he had always known and was glad it was finally right. Priya came by my office on the second morning and sat down without speaking for a moment. Then she said she was glad she had kept those documents. I told her I was too. Richard's name remained on certain company filings for now, but the authority his name had carried, the unchallenged deference, the automatic narrative, was gone. People now knew the shape of the real story. And once people understand the shape of something true, the false version simply stops fitting around it. 3 weeks after the gala, I stood at a podium in my own name for the first time. It was a smaller event, a sector roundtable organized by one of the investor groups, and the topic was innovation and intellectual authorship in early-stage companies. I had been invited to speak. I wore the same clean dark suit. I looked out at the room and recognized several faces. Some had been at the gala. Some were board members. Some were journalists who had covered the story. I spoke for 20 minutes about building something from scratch. About the specific, quiet effort it takes to turn an idea into something real. About the importance of accurate records, not just for legal protection but for the integrity of an industry that depends on knowing who actually creates what it sells. I spoke without bitterness. When I finished, the room applauded. Not the thundering wave that follows a performance, but the steady, attentive kind that comes when people feel they have heard something worth carrying with them. Afterward, Constance Webb shook my hand. Harmon Tate caught my eye from across the room and gave the same short nod he had given at the gala. I collected my notes and walked outside into the evening air. What I had spent years building was finally, clearly, and permanently mine. Not because I had argued loudest, but because I had waited, gathered the truth, and given it the right moment to speak for itself.